When I finished Mockingjay, the third book in the Hunger Games trilogy, about a month ago, I really didn't like it too much, and I feel like a lot of its readers shared this sentiment with me. However, when I was browsing around wanting to read more a little bit about the book, I came across a piece of trivia that really intrigued me. Suzanne Collins' father is a Vietnam War veteran. Now, if I weren't in a class this semester dedicated to the Vietnam War and all the films that concern themselves with it, I probably wouldn't have been swayed by this piece of trivia. However, last week when I was trying to fall asleep, I had several epiphanies at once, and now Mockingjay is one of my favorite books ever, and I definitely can say that the Hunger Games series goes right behind the Harry Potter series and one of my favorite book series ever. Now, if you couldn't tell already, this video is probably going to contain lots of spoilers for the Hunger Games trilogy, so if you haven't read the books yet, I would recommend watching this video at a later time. As the title suggests, when I reached my epiphany, I was actually able to make the connections between the parallels between the Hunger Games books and sort of the Vietnam War, and as well as the Vietnam War, also the Vietnam War film conventions that I've been learning all semester in class. And if I never really understood these conventions, I probably wouldn't be able to understand that Suzanne Collins used them and showed a mastery of them. So I think I'm going to go analogy by analogy and show you how it clearly lines up with not only the war, but the conventions that the films use to portray the war as well. So the first is Reaping Day, which I think we can all agree is clearly an analogy for the draft that they used during the Vietnam War. The only thing different, of course, is that you can volunteer to be in someone else's place. In Catching Fire, what's really interesting is when Peeta and Katniss go on the trip in the train around to all the different districts in Panem. That bit of the book reminds me of this one scene from a documentary, I think it was in Hearts and Minds, which is a Vietnam War documentary, in which one of the POWs comes back in town and there's just like a big celebration for him. Alright, now on to Mockingjay, which clearly has so many examples of it. One of my favorite examples and one of my favorite epiphanies that I had was the whole convention and some of these Vietnam War films that the veterans who served the Vietnam War and lived because they're veterans go back to Vietnam to fight, and this time they win. This can be seen a lot in the Rambo films. Rambo was a Vietnam War veteran, then he goes back to Vietnam and gets POWs and kicks butt, and it's just a really cool character. How this relates to the Hunger Games is when in Catching Fire, where the Quarter Quell, all of the previous champions had to go back into the games, it's exactly like that. And when I realized that, I was like, holy crap, that is so cool. And I'm not trying to say that the actual Hunger Games is the war, because I believe the war is the war. I think the sort of last and one of the really, really big conventions that Suzanne Collins uses is the fact that no one really knows the reasons that they're fighting, and there's not a really good distinction between who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. Now, I really appreciate all the scenes in which Katniss is dealing with President Snow and kind of having this war in her head about whether he was telling her the truth or not, and it's really interesting to see kind of the blurred distinction of what is good and what is not, because in the book, when I was reading it, I began to think, is Katniss really doing the right thing? Like, is she really our symbol of goodness in this book? In some ways she's not, but of course because she's the protagonist, she is. And because in a lot of our literature now we see so many anti-heroes, and because in the Vietnam War you see so many anti-heroes in the films, it becomes really hard to distinguish between who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And what Suzanne Collins does in Mockingjay is so interesting because there are these three kind of forces, and none of them are really good, but none of them are the bad force either. So those are just a couple of things. I had to keep it quick because I wanted this to be a short video, but if you somehow know a lot about war and stuff and want to make more connections to how the Hunger Games fits into different war things, I would definitely love to talk about that with you. I'm definitely really interested in this subject, and I definitely love the fact that Mockingjay is, to me, now more a very complex book. It's very much a war genre book than a sci-fi book, and definitely, for me at least, the first war genre novel that I've read that's young adult fiction. If you've been watching for a while, you definitely know that I appreciate these authors who can put these intricacies into young adult novels that the average 12-year-old wouldn't understand. But since we're an older, more learned audience, we're able to pick up on it more and be able to appreciate all these things that the author's putting into it. And last, when I was reading Mockingjay, I was very disappointed that its conclusion didn't include a lot of discussion about the different themes that it was bringing up throughout the novel, as we're so conditioned to understand through John Green's books and through J.K. Rowling's books. in which the characters just have these long discussions where you're understanding all of the concepts and they're bringing it all in together. And I very much like that Susan Collins, because it's such an allegory, there's no room for the discussion at the end. The discussion takes place throughout the 3 novels themselves. Alright you guys, I hope I gave you some cool things on which to ponder today, and I cannot wait to chat soon.